You're buying a house. You have contingencies in that contract, and those contingencies allow you to get out of the contract, right? Yeah, you do a home inspection and you find some really terrible things and you want out of the contract. That contingency lets you get out. But wait a minute, there's another party to the contract, the seller. Can the seller back out of a contract? Do you want to buy their house? Can they kick you out of their contract? That's what we're talking about today, and we're starting right now.
I'm Sherri Green with Coldwell Banker. Welcome to my YouTube channel that guides home sellers and home buyers in Washington, D.C. and Northern Virginia.
So you're buying a house and you know you can get out of the contract. You know you have a couple of contingencies in that contract, and you know that if something terrible were to be found in the home inspection or the appraisal's low, you can get out of that contract. And we'll talk about that a little bit further as we get through the video today. But the first thing, and what this video really is about, is can a seller back out of a contract? You've offered to buy the house. They've taken your offer. It has become a legal contract. So you have told them, I'll buy your house for these terms, price, timing, contingencies, and they've said yes. So can they cancel your contract? Can they just do a big void on the contract? It's a good question, and there are two answers. There's sort of a direct answer, and there's an indirect answer too. So technically, if the contract is free of any seller contingencies, then no. Technically, they can't back out of a contract, but they can indirectly. Now let's back up for a minute, because what I just said there is very important. If there aren't any seller contingencies. So let's first talk about the direct way a seller could back out of a contract. If a seller has a seller contingency that allows them to back out of the contract should something not happen, then yes, they can back out of the contract. That contingency, a seller contingency, allows them to do that. What kind of seller contingency could they have? Let's say they're selling the house to you, but they have to find where they're going to, where they're moving to, what house they are buying. What if they can't find that house? If they have a seller contingency that says this contract is contingent on me finding a house to purchase by a certain date, and they don't find that house by that date, they can back out of that contract. So that would be a direct way that a seller could cancel the contract. Now, certainly that's something you would know up front. You would have agreed to that term of the contract and said, yes, I understand. And I agree to the seller contingency of you having to find your next house. But if the contingencies are all related to your side of the transaction, an appraisal contingency, a home inspection contingency, can the seller just get out? Indirectly, there are ways a seller can get out, and that is what I want to explain. So let's say you're doing a home inspection inside of your purchase contract, and you find lots of things in the house that are wrong, terribly wrong. Maybe there's a crack in the foundation. Maybe the house needs a whole new roof. Maybe there's a leak in the roof that your inspector discovered. What you would do is go to that seller and say, let's negotiate getting those things repaired, or let's negotiate a credit that I would get at closing. If the seller refuses to negotiate with you, if the seller refuses to offer you some sort of credit that is reasonable, some sort of repair that is reasonable, then you can back out of the contract. So indirectly, the seller has forced your hand and has forced you to cancel that contract. That doesn't happen very often. Both agents should be encouraging each party of the contract to come to a resolution that makes good sense for everybody. But if the seller refuses to participate, then your hand could be forced, and you as the buyer, yes, could cancel that contract, and that is an indirect result of the seller's actions. The same holds true for an appraisal. If you have an appraisal contingency in your purchase, whether you're buying cash and you want an appraisal to confirm you're paying the right amount, or whether you have a lender and you have to get an appraisal to confirm that you are paying an appropriate amount for the house. If that appraisal comes back and it is low, it is in both parties' best interest to find a happy medium there. Does the buyer bring a little more to closing to make up the difference? Does the seller come down in their seller price all the way to the appraisal number? Or do we find a way to meet in the middle? That's what should happen if the appraisal is low. But what if the seller says, no, thank you. You told me you'd pay this much for my house, and that's what I want. I refuse to negotiate with you. Again, the seller could force the buyer's hand to make a decision to leave the contract. So that would be an indirect way that the seller has voided the contract. It's technically the buyer voiding it, but I think you see my point. Now, can a seller just say, I want out, I've changed my mind, I don't want to sell this house anymore? Not technically. It is a legal contract that the two parties have signed and agreed to. Real estate contracts are in writing and they are legally binding. And when a seller says, I'm going to sell, and a buyer says, I want to buy, and the two parties agree to a contract to do that, then legally we have a situation on our hand where both parties need to perform. If the seller just up and decides they don't want to perform, it's a legal situation. I actually just had this happen. And the first thing I want to say is this: it doesn't happen often. It is a lot of work for an agent to get a house ready to sell, and it's a lot of mental work and work for the seller to get their house ready to sell. It's a big commitment to sign that contract with a listing agent to put their house on the market, to allow people to do showings, and then to agree with the buyer on the terms of a contract. So a seller just up and backing out of a contract happens very rarely, but I did just have it happen, so I wanted to make sure we talked through that as well. In my case, my team was representing the buyer, and she had found this house that she wanted to buy and had gotten under contract. The seller's family was very upset that they had decided to sell this house, and the seller decided they wanted to get out of the contract. Now they have a legally binding contract, my client, the buyer, and the seller. The seller also has a contract with their listing agent. They've asked them to sell this house, and they've agreed to pay that listing agent to do so, to get the house ready to market it and to get it under contract. So the seller is sitting there with two legally binding contracts: a listing agreement to market and sell the house, and a contract with the buyer to sell the house to that person. So in this case, because the owner's family was so upset that they had decided to sell this property, the owner decided it was in their best interest, their family's best interest, to get out of the contract. Now, technically, the buyer, in this case my client, could sue the seller for performance. They have agreed to a contract, they have agreed to sell this house to her, and if she's very unhappy, which she was, she could choose to sue the owner for their lack of performance. A real estate contract is a legally binding document. And if the seller just decides to lock the doors, walk away, and not perform, not sign at the closing table, then the buyer does have the right to sue that seller. What the buyer has to figure out is it in their best interest to do that? To hire an attorney, to take the time, to tie up their earnest money deposit, to tie up the lender, because the lender still has an open contract and an open underwriting process on that contract for that buyer. The buyer has to decide if all of that is in their best interest, or is it just best to move on and find another house? It's a tough question, right? And it's an answer that only that buyer can answer. In this case, the seller knew that they were in the wrong, if you will. They knew that they had messed up the buyer's future, if you will, and they decided to easily return the EMD without question. So that was an easy part. What also happened was this: the seller wound up agreeing to pay the real estate commission. Like I said in the beginning, they had a contract with that brokerage, with that agent, to sell their house, to market it, prepare it, and get it under contract. And that agent did their job. And so did the buyer's agents. So the seller knew that they needed to make it right. They gave the buyer back their EMD, and they paid their listing brokerage the commission. And yes, it trickled down to the buyer's agent's team as well. It was a small price in their mind to pay to get out of that contract and hopefully not be sued by the brokerage for a breach of contract on the listing agreement, and hopefully not be sued by the buyer for their breach of contract to sell the house. My client really needed to move and really wanted to move. And in the end, it turned out to be okay. It was a little bit of a heartburn and a little bit of a hiccup, and certainly a disappointment. You never want to start over. And in this market, it's crazy and it's horrible to have to start over at any time. But in this market, it's even harder. But my team found her a great house, actually in a place she really loved. And it turned out in her mind to be a sign that she had wound up getting the house she should have and didn't get one that maybe would not have worked out for her or had some sort of bad karma attached to it because of what had happened. She decided not to sue the seller and to move on and buy something else. But not every seller may be that lucky. I have a very sweet client, and she was okay with moving on after a little bit or a lot of disappointment. So can a seller back out of a contract? Certainly they can. If they have a clause that allows them to back out legally, that would be a direct way of doing it. They can also indirectly refuse to negotiate pieces of the contract they've already agreed to with the client, and the buyer can back out because they don't feel like they are being negotiated with properly. Or maybe they could just decide to get out, and maybe they'll have a client as nice as mine, or they may end up getting sued. Have you seen this happen? Have you ever gone under contract and the seller changed their mind? My guess is no. It is very rare. In my whole real estate career, I've seen this once. And that was this time, and it happened this year. It's not typically the way we do business. When a seller puts their house on the market, they want to sell and the buyer wants to buy. What questions do you have about the real estate process? Leave me a question in the comments and let me know. I'd love to answer anything that you are thinking about when it comes to the buying and selling process. And if you're new to my channel, make sure you subscribe. I post videos every week on the buying and selling process in Washington, D.C. and Northern Virginia, and I'd love to have you come along.